Education performance in developed countries, including the United States, is a mixed bag. That's according to the latest Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, a periodic project of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In the United States, math performance by 15-year-olds was worse than in 2018, among the lowest ever, as a matter of fact. Reading and science held steady. For analysis of what the results mean, we turn to the Executive Director of Teach for America's D.C. region, Ryan Tauriainen. Mr. Tauriainen, good to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the PISA assessments. These come out periodically, and they're done internationally?
They come out every 3 years. The PISA began in the year 2000. It's an international test. It's actually created in France predominantly. And what it does is it compares standardized test results in reading, math, and science across over 80 different countries or locations. In 2022, in fact, 620,000 15-year-olds across 81 locales participated in the PISA. And as you mentioned, the results from those tests just came out on December 5th.
So this is not a meta-assessment of results reported by different nations with different systems. This is 650,000 kids everywhere taking the same test.
Yes, the same test in, of course, their national language. And interestingly enough, this test is really at forefront a literacy test, even when it's focusing on math or science. And the focus of the test does change every 3 years. It is still at its heart a literacy test. So this particular test that was taken in 2022, which was actually 1 year later than it should have been because of COVID-19, this test was focused more on math skills. But the thing that's interesting about the PISA math test is most of the questions that are asked of students are in written form. So they may have to read a passage or even a story and be able to take data or information from what they read in order to answer the math questions. So it's not a test where you're going to see a bunch of equations and kids are going to do computations. It really focuses on their reading skills at the same time and also has them apply real-world solutions to problems that they may encounter.
Now, the United States and the federal government in a number of different domains, including the Education Department, has been pursuing STEM and the idea of STEM, math and science. And, these are all math requirement types of topics. What should we take away from this in the fact that the scores drop so badly for that particular test in the United States?
There's a lot to take out of it. As you mentioned, the scores did drop. In fact, they're 18 points lower this go around than they were when the test results were first released the first time the PISA was done. Those test results were released in 2003. And so all these years later, and we're actually on average performing lower in math than we were in 2003. The other thing I want to mention before I get into that is that some people would look at these results and actually think that the United States improved, interestingly enough, because our ranking internationally grew. We actually moved up to being 26th in math, which previously we were in the 30s. So you may think that, the United States did so much better, they're improving. And in fact, what we're seeing is it's just that other countries decrease their scores even more than ours. They may have been more heavily affected by COVID-19. The effects of COVID-19 are something that's very challenging for school districts to improve upon. So, for instance, the hiring aspect of teachers is what's really, I think, affecting these scores more than anything, especially in STEM. To put this in, I'm going to speak specifically from my experience as a school and district leader in Washington, D.C. Hiring math teachers, STEM teachers, is the most difficult out of all the positions. And it is especially difficult now because Generation Z, the generation who will be becoming novice teachers these years, when they major in STEM fields, they get offers for other types of work in other fields that are much more lucrative than teaching. So it can be extremely difficult to recruit someone who majored in math or computer science or some other type of science and to come into teaching when they know the income level that they'll be entering in is much lower than something that they could be doing otherwise. And so that has been the biggest challenge for schools in the United States, is actually being able to get STEM experts to fill these STEM classrooms. I can tell you multiple times, I have been in situations where we recruited a fantastic person who was passionate about education, really wanted to be a teacher, but did not necessarily have the strongest math background. And unfortunately, that was the position that was open. And at a certain point, you have to fill that position, and you may put someone in who's not the most comfortable with teaching math, but they do it because they really want to be a teacher. And you try your best to be able to build that person's skills to make them into the best math teacher they can be. But we're still, unfortunately, lacking people who come in on day one with expertise in STEM fields. And so that's really affecting our students, especially after the effects of COVID-19.
We're speaking with Ryan Tauriainen. He is Executive Director of Teach for America's D.C. region. He's also a former White House Fellow with the Education Department. And is there any policy or operational change? I mean, the Education Department has permeated itself deeper and deeper into smaller and smaller aspects of public education over the decades. And public education seems to be getting worse and worse in the outcomes over the ages here. So what could happen at the federal level to improve the situation, do you think?
One of the things I learned when I worked at the Federal Department of Education is how frustrating it can be, because there is usually all carrot and no stick is what we sometimes would say at the department. So education in the United States is very much controlled at the local level, at the state level, and very little of it, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your outlook, can be decided at the federal level. Now, one thing that the federal government, I believe, can do, and I do think that Secretary Cardona has addressed this, is that in the wake of COVID-19, one of the strategies that we know is actually having a strong effect in improving scores, whether in reading or math, is high dosage tutoring. That is pretty much a no-brainer, one would say. Like, oh yes, if students get more face time and that's independent or in very small groups with a tutor or a teacher, they're likely to improve upon their scores. And absolutely, it makes total sense. The problem was, where are the people? Where is the money to fund this? Well, because of money that came out of the CARES Act, such as the ESSER fund, the Elementary and Secondary Education Emergency Relief Fund, and the GEAR fund, which is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. There was billions and billions of dollars dumped into education the years of and following COVID-19. And a lot of that money could be spent on creating and hiring programs to provide one-on-one or perhaps three-on-one tutors for the students who had the most decrease in their math and reading. And we are seeing firsthand in DC, that is probably the intervention that is having the most effect on students. So I believe that the federal government could do more to put money towards, or providing grant money towards, creating and paying for these high dosage tutoring programs, especially in schools that suffered the most learning loss.
Yeah, that's remarkable, because you say that, billions and billions and billions were poured into education during the COVID as part of relief. And yet look at the scores and look at the results, at the local education level were pretty bad. And I think a lot of school districts are still digging out. So what you're saying is the federal government should redirect maybe its focus on where funds go in what educational function to actually have some leverage in making scores go up?
Yes, absolutely. I think in that first round of over $20 billion going towards public education, the thing that we have to remember is very little of that was actually going towards the education process. It was actually going towards refurbishing and remodeling buildings so that when students came back, they would be able to function. They would have proper ventilation. They would have all the PPE and the sanitary aspects of the school to make sure that we weren't passing along viruses and diseases, since that was obviously becoming the focus of the world at that point. And so a lot of that money actually went into remodeling the entire buildings of schools, sometimes building entirely new structures. So that's where the money went at first. Yes, absolutely. And then after that sort of round of remodeling happened is when people started to focus more on the after school or during school programs that could improve on the education of their students. Unfortunately, that's still in its birth stage, I would say. We're still very, very new. So that's where I would invest more dollars right now.
Yeah, because I guess it's easier to measure how many cubic feet per minute your new air equipment is moving, or how many filters you installed, or how many new buildings you put up, than it is to measure education outcomes. That's longer and more subtle, isn't it?
It is. And unfortunately, we were doing distance learning for a year to 2 years or longer in some places. And unfortunately, in many of our rural communities, that wasn't really an option. They may not have had the infrastructure for internet access, for every student to have a laptop. I met superintendents from very small districts who really inspired me because they went above and beyond creating these mobile